Hi, this is Leo. Thank you for being here. A while ago, I was watching the anime adaptation of Hinomaru Zumo, a manga written and illustrated by Kawada. For those of you who don't know it, it is a fairly straightforward martial arts shonen whose premise might sound familiar. It is about a group of underdog teenagers climbing their way upwards in the world of competitive martial arts through grit, effort, and teamwork. With the main gimmick being that said martial art is sumo, of all things, which, as an amusing side effect, means that most of the characters are chunkier versions of typical manga archetypes. It is a nice enough series which originally caught my attention because of the intense, beautifully composed fight scenes, and especially its signature trait, the dramatic finishing techniques, which is why I was a bit surprised by how deflated they felt to me in the adaptation, even when the overall quality wasn't poor at all. It felt like the same visual techniques that make the action so captivating in the medium of comics had the exactly opposite effect when directly translated to animation. And that was fascinating to me. Taking a step back, I'm a big fan of action media, and I spent a fair bit of my allotted time on this earth studying their intricacies in depth. A sentence which in this context means watching way too many martial art movies and pestering my friends and family with my lengthy opinions on them. Something that I find particularly interesting is observing how different works find alternative venues to represent the somewhat abstract concept of action. From the audiovisual spectacle of movies, to the kinesthetic satisfaction of video games, to the fascinating ensemble of optical illusions that take the form of comics. Stretching a bit the famous quote by Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan, "The medium is the message," I believe it's fair to say that there is no such thing as a generic fight scene or an archetypal action sequence, if not completely in the abstract. As in practice, instances of these are always mediated, embodied in an art form that determines their internal structure. To put it in simpler terms, let's take the humble explosion. An explosion in a movie is a completely different object from one in a painting, and even more from one in a book. What makes up that explosion, what we like or dislike about it, how effective it is in its role of explosion, all of that is strictly connected to the medium in which it is represented. And since I really like explosions, if I want to understand what makes them so darn fun, I've got to take a look at how they work in the right context. With that said, let's go back to the topic of manga. Comics in general are very important to me. I grew up with them, as my family house is simply bursting with the things, but manga in particular have a special place in my heart. Partially because they were the first comics that I discovered by myself, but mainly because of the way they do action. Growing up, I developed a greater and greater revulsion towards the otaku industry as a whole, and so it would seem obvious for me to move away from that environment. Maybe appreciating those manga outside of the mainstream entertainment industry, sure, but certainly not indulging in any series that does exactly what I'm opposed to so fiercely. But as you might have guessed by now, instead I keep coming back to them because action is more often found in mainstream entertainment, and manga action is just so good for me. Beyond those that manage to mostly avoid these pitfalls and tell interesting original stories while still being fully part of the industry, a fair number of some of my favorite action mangas fall squarely within those unsavory practices, even if, I must concede, they tend to do so in wildly more entertaining ways than most. I cannot ignore or excuse their glaring flaws, yet I find the positives in them so deeply enjoyable and masterfully executed that I can somewhat accept the bad parts. Like I would tolerate spending time with a person I despise if that means I get to have a free meal at my favorite restaurant. I can just focus on the juiciness of the steak while ignoring their unfortunate opinions on feminism and the like. And so, circling back to the start, When I saw that slightly dissatisfying adaptation of a sumo-focused shonen manga, I started thinking about all of this. What makes manga resonate so much with me? How they manage to create, with still black and white images, so much dynamism and intensity to rival and sometimes even surpass animation. But I'm not an artist, nor I ever truly studied much graphical design at all, so if I wanted to make any form of proper analysis, I had to do some research first. Cue in one of the best books on comics ever written and drawn, Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art by Scott McCloud, which is not only an amazingly good read on its own right and an absolute must for anyone interested in the subject, but it also presents insight in Japanese comics that perfectly fit what I was looking for. I will be quoting this book a lot already and had to stop myself from going too far or this video would go on pretty much forever. I will start by going over some relevant characteristics of manga as a style of comics, which in turn will form the basis for an analysis of what I found to be the most interesting techniques used to make the action scenes so dynamic and intense. And we'll conclude by going over the challenges that these same techniques pose when adapted to animation. Be forewarned, I will be showing bits from a lot of different series over the course of this video, and even if decontextualized, these technically count as spoilers, so beware. A list of all works referenced is in the description, which is also handy for people who might be interested in checking out the source material for themselves. Without further ado then, let's get into it. Part 1. The two sides of the coin. I think it's fair to say that manga are very stylized. The depiction of reality is, on average, somewhat exaggerated, both in excess and in defect. Manga switch between not bothering to show certain details to enlarging or over-defining them to almost grotesque proportions, and often do both things at once. The internal logic of manga is of a dreamlike, malleable quality, showing what is important by making it violently preponderant and hiding what is not in focus by making it blend seamlessly with the white void of the blank page. I believe this tendency speaks of one of the greatest dualism in manga as an art form, comprised of two elements that might appear somewhat contradictory. I call them melodrama and contemplation. A melodrama is, according to the dictionary, a work, such as a movie or play, characterized by extravagant theatricality and by the predominance of plot and physical action over characterization. Even then, manga go further than most, as the melodrama is not just a stylistic choice, it's the predominant law of physics that determines most of their internal consistency. Everything, in the average manga, revolves around its emotional or thematic context. So it is that the same character can be drawn as a cartoonish caricature during a humoristic skit, and as an imposing figure during a dramatic moment. Details appear and disappear from a scene as their importance is stated or surpassed. Visual design is more often due to the role or personality of what is portrayed rather than any practical consideration, and so on and so forth. A panel of a manga, more often than not, doesn't show the reader what is going on in the scene, strictly speaking, as much as it visually represents what the current events feel like, either from the perspective of a character or according to what the author wants to convey. I call this the contextual focus of a sequence, that is, the underlying emotion, theme, or message that is visually expressed in a scene alongside the narrative taking place and gives it its full meaning. So, when an angry character is drawn with distinctly more demonic and ominous feature than normal, the contextual focus is the fury. Or when a female character, full body, is drawn above the confines of the panels and her clothing practically merges with the figure, the contextual focus is that the reader and what other characters are present in the scene are supposed to find it just really, really hot. When I talk about contemplation, instead, I am referring to the typically Japanese artistic preoccupation with negative space on the one hand, and the fleeting, instantaneous nature of beauty on the other. Quoting MacLeod, as I got this insight from him, and he explains the concept better than I ever could, traditional Western art and literature doesn't wander much. On the whole, we're a pretty goal oriented culture, but in the East, there is a rich tradition of cyclical and labyrinthine works of art. Japanese comics may be heirs to this tradition, in the way they so often emphasize being there over getting there. For in Japan, more than anywhere else, comics is an art of intervals. In the Eastern artistic traditions, the elements omitted have as much importance as those that are presented, and so the relationship between foreground and background becomes central, together with that of objects and the negative space, that is, the space between and around the subject of an image. Mangas are mostly drawn in black and white, which makes it very easy to play with presence and absence, as anything that is left blank is not necessarily empty, as much as simply implied, suggested, or temporarily unimportant. The other side of MacLeod's observation is in the focus of the here and now that manga presents, particularly suited to a medium, like that of comics, comprised of still images that together form the illusion of motion, which is the reason why Will Eisner referred to comics as sequential art. I find that manga are at their best when these two aspects work together. The beauty of fleeting details combined with the exaggerations resulting from the contextual focus can result in panels that capture instants of impossible intensity, such as extreme facial expressions with an impact similar of that of theatrical masks, fantastical vistas as seen from impossible perspectives, frozen frames of bodies in motion that makes no anatomical sense, and so on. This duality, I believe, is also exemplified in the patterns of transitions between panels as presented by MacLeod. As I briefly mentioned, in comics, time is basically an optical illusion, created by the psychological mechanism of closure. That is, the automatic function of the human brain that fills gaps in visual perception so as to present a full image at all cost. And the reason, for example, of why we see a circular intermittent shape as a circle instead of just a series of disconnected parts. This tendency is used in a much more abstract way in both comics and film editing, for example, as we instinctively interpret two images or events placed next to each other as connected. In comics, most motions happen during closure, that is, as the reader imagines what happens between one panel and the next. The wider the transition between the panels, the more abstract the work that the reader will do, which is the reason why MacLeod classifies transitions in 6 different categories. Moment to moment, with little closure needed, action to action, focusing on a single subject, subject to subject while staying within a single scene or idea, scene to scene, requiring much more deductive reasoning, aspect to aspect, which bypasses time and focuses on individual details of a place, idea, or mood, and finally the non sequitur, transition without any discernible logic. In Western comics, the most common transitions are action to action, followed by subject to subject and scene to scene. But in Japanese comics, there is a much greater prevalence of both moment to moment transition and especially aspect to aspect ones. The first are commonly used to prolong a sequence and create tension or intensity, while the latter convey atmosphere or capture a wide picture by showing it in a fragmented, timeless way. These fit the purpose of both melodrama and contemplation, as they fracture the flow of time and focus the attention on details that would normally be lost. Understanding comics goes much further in this analysis, but I believe we have now more than enough elements to move into the real meat of what I want to talk about. What does all of this tell us about action scenes? Part 2: Tricks of the Trade, or Cool Trends That I Noticed. As I mentioned before, The main reason why I like manga so much is that they perfectly convey what I find so captivating about action and fighting. But what that actually is a bit harder to pin down. It's the intensity and uncertainty of danger, the clash of wills of people on opposite sides, the way action tests a person's conviction and identity when strained to the max, the strategy and prep work that goes into it, the ingenuity required to survive that which cannot be predicted, the inherent fleeting beauty of death and destruction, and I could go on like this for a while. I am really hard pressed at conjuring up a simple, concise explanation that doesn't end up being a rumbly connection of examples and noises. But that is exactly how most manga are. The way I see it, the synthesis of melodrama and contemplation that characterizes them manages to create this fantastic phenomenon of super detailed yet super bombastic sequences of events, where I can simultaneously be showered in pyrotechnics and breathtaking feats of martial prowess and examine from a detached distance the shape of each explosion, how they came to be, and how everyone involved really feels about them. This is no small feat, and it is realized through a variety of tricks and techniques that differ wildly from author to author, but amongst which I isolated three general trends that I find to be the most common and easily recognizable. Since I like to give name to things, I call them hierarchical proportions, time shenanigans, and my personal favorite, enter the void. The first one follows closely what I already mentioned in part 1, that is, how the physical properties of bodies in manga are more directly connected to the contextual focus of the scene rather than any form of realism or logic. The term hierarchical proportions is used to describe works of art, such as some ancient Egyptian and Christian depiction of gods, saints, or kings, in which the dimensions of the figures depicted depends entirely on their relative social or religious status, where small means meek and big means worthy of devotion. I find this concept an apt comparison to the common technique in action manga to exaggerate, deform, or enlarge a character's proportions to convey the meaning implicit in the contextual focus of the scene. This includes more subtle examples, like enlarging a fist to make it feel threatening and imposing, or more overt ones, like having a character's leg appear to elongate grotesquely because of the speed of their strikes, and so on. For example, this panel from Kengan Ashua illustrates my point very clearly. The character on the right possesses superhuman strength as his main gimmick, and that is conveyed by deforming the body of his opponent to a ridiculous degree, way beyond what a human being should be able to take without dying horribly. Moreover, his face, contorted in a furious expression, is the central and only clear element of the panel, while the rest of his body is blurry and distorted. His strength, effort, and concentration are all apparent with just a glance, as is the incredible pain that his opponent must be going through. Moving on to the second technique, time shenanigans are a bit more complex. I already mentioned how in comics time is convoluted, to say the least, more a result of visual shorthand rather than following any consistent rules. All of this is just dialed up to 11 during manga action scenes, as the flow of time itself falls prey to the influence of contextual focus as much as anything else, and its results are the main responsible for manga being simultaneously punchy and detailed. An example of this is the trick of compressing multiple actions in a single panel, showing them simultaneously. This could result, for example, in a flurry of blows being conveyed through a series of motion lines, or a character moving quickly in an environment represented by being drawn multiple times in different poses and positions, or what is probably my favorite, showing the beginning, effect, and conclusion of a single action all at once. As an example of this, I want to use what is probably the most famous panel in Tsugumomo, the one that really sold me on the whole series. Starting from the right, the eyes of the reader see the figure of the character nonchalantly perform a simple gesture, follow the cloth that she is using to attack as it weaves into a spiral, and finally connects with the creature on the left, destroying it in a gruesome and exaggerated explosion. The entire motion is encapsulated in this frozen, impossible moment, happening in its full expression in the mind of the reader. Another way in which time shenanigans are very often used is with dialogue. As a general rule, speaking doesn't require time or effort in a manga setting. Characters are able to have ridiculously long and eloquent conversations in the middle of trading blows with each other, whether that is for banter, to declare the ingenious plan that they will use to defeat the opponent, to explain the mechanism behind their special attack, or anything else. Communication is direct and instantaneous, unless it is more dramatic for it not to be, of course. Lastly, what I so dramatically called Enter the Void consists, in short, of the integration of metastructures in the concrete reality of a scene, which is a fancy way to say merging abstract elements of comics, like motion lines or the border of panels, with the physicality of whatever is happening at the time. This includes moments where the distinction between the background and the characters becomes blurry in the midst of motion, actions that fuse together the character's body with the motion lines that they produce, really powerful attacks represented as a white void rather than being drawn in full, objects appearing from outside the panels to represent their otherworldly nature, and so on. This panel from Bakido, in which a scantily clad Yakuza boss is being slashed by legendary swordsman Miyamoto Musashi, other than being simply delightful, provides some great examples of this concept. The core of this entire fight is in how Musashi, who prides himself in being able to cut anything apart, even boulders or steel plates, is not able to cut through the palace of muscle, direct quote, that is this man. His slash is so intense and perfectly executed that his arms disappear into it, and even the panel itself seems to be bisected. But this mountain of a man is able to withstand it protected only by a loincloth. This series is a blessing and a curse, I swear. None of these techniques are meant to be used in isolation. They are always combined, mixed together to create compositions of truly staggering visual impact. Each of the panels I showed as example for one technique or the other can easily be analyzed under a different lens, and can be appreciated fully only when considering all of the elements at once. From the technical, move-by-move approach of martial arts series like Kengan Ashura or Hajime no Hippo, to bombastic, large-scale teenage fantasies like Tsugumomo and UQ Holder, to more brutal, mature and unforgiving settings like those of Golden Kamuy and Chainsaw Man, manga authors have shown time and time again how versatile and broad its unique style of action can be for all sorts of narrative and aesthetic sensibilities. Part 3. From Stasis to Motion. With all this in mind, let us go back one final time to the teenage spirit of sumo. The fight scenes in this manga perfectly fit all that I've mentioned, the characters acquiring almost demonic characteristics when pushed to the limits, multiple stages of an action being performed in a single panel, the strongest techniques being accompanied by abstract visual effects that merge with the physicality of the scene, etc. All of this makes the series visually striking and distinct, allowing the reader to feel the strong emotions of the characters, the weight and power of their moves, and to glimpse at an epic dimension behind a sport that, taken factually, is actually not very flashy at all. Now, I don't think that the anime adaptation is bad per se. It is entertaining and follows the events of the original faithfully, but the same scenes that were the linchpin of the whole series, those stylish, static, and yet incredibly dynamic panels, are realized in a way that makes them somewhat toothless. This is, of course, a subjective remark, But the real deal breaker for me is that they try to recapture the same effects as the original by halting the action entirely and framing it like a picture. And in animation, that only looks like a stopped frame to me, making the original drawing feel much more dynamic and alive in comparison. Hinomaru Zumo is not an isolated case at that. Another very similar example is the rendition of the Tsugumomo panel I talked about before, which, in the anime adaptation, is even more directly equivalent to the original. I believe that the main problem lies in the fact that most of the same techniques that I went over before are incompatible or even detrimental to the rhythm and sensibilities of 2D animation. Switching media is never an easy process, as each has its own peculiarities, from the creation process to what the audience must do to access its contents, and therefore every attempt at translation is actually an act of creation. Certain tricks of the trade are easy enough to adapt, such as the hierarchical proportions, which are used as commonly in anime as they are in manga. But most of the other things I mentioned until now are more like puzzles to be solved by the animators rather than foundations on which to build. The biggest hurdle is probably time. Some tricks, like showing a character's after image to show off their speed, or representing a bunch of attacks as an indistinct simultaneous cloud of motion lines, are perfectly suited for both media. But animation just cannot get to the same level of abstraction that comics can in regards to time flow. It needs to show an action being performed from start to finish, or at least in a way that the viewer can follow with the same clarity in real time, to achieve the same level of impact as comic panels, which of course requires a lot more work. Another significant difference between the two media is that anime is, shockingly, in full color. That means that most of the tricks I included in Enter the Void are inherently harder to do, as the simple dualism of black and white makes most of it intuitively possible. This is not to say that similar effects can't be achieved, far from it, only that this adds an entirely new dimension to be taken into consideration, and that, therefore, there is no such thing as a simple direct translation with any kind of metastructural techniques. The last of the challenges I will mention in some detail has to do with adapting an author's personal style. Manga aesthetic is arguably a pretty formulaic one, but that doesn't mean that different artists don't have their own unique take on it. On the contrary, what I find most fascinating about the best action manga out there is how much of a difference the stylistic choices can make in the impact of a scene. Baki wouldn't be Baki without its near grotesque interpretation of muscular male bodies. Vagabond's sketchy, naturalistic style gives off a completely different feeling than Gamarant's more stylish and frantic approach, even when the subject matter of katana swordplay might look so similar on the surface, and so on. But there are a lot more manga authors than there are animation studios, which in turn have their own go-to styles, approaches, and mannerisms. Adaptations will then necessarily need to find a compromise between the drawing style of the original series and their own areas of expertise. Certain high budget adaptations get to have truly unique styles that are a blend of both in a way that makes it its own original thing, such as what happened with JoJo or Demon Slayer. But other lesser known series with distinct styles of their own can be a bit less fortunate. The best anime adaptations are those that manage to sidestep the problems presented by the incompatibilities of the two media, and recreate an equivalent experience to that of the source material by capitalizing on animation's strong suits. Demon Slayer comes to mind with its impeccable animation and sound design, managing to create action scenes so captivating as to, in my opinion at least, become a better work than the original manga, or in how Blade of the Immortals adaptation balances the challenge posed by the manga's abstract and crowded compositions of violence with very interesting editing and directing choices. The retelling of a story can bring forth new depth and meaning with every iteration, and this does not only include its more overtly narrative aspects, but also those of a more visceral and spectacular nature, such as action scenes. To conclude, I hope to have shown both what makes manga so unique in their own rendition of action within the confines of comics, and how this poses a stimulating challenge when adapting them to animation, whose results must never be taken for granted. While I might not like the otaku industry at large, it is without a doubt that there are countless people of great talent working within it, whose craft is worth being noted, appreciated, and analysed. Thank you for watching. Well, that was it. Thank you very much to anyone who reached this point. I appreciate the dedication. This was much longer than I had originally expected, but since it was my first time ever using a video editing tool or recording myself or something a bit more official and structured than just sending audio messages to people, I had a lot to learn. It was very fun. I don't know if I'll do it again, but I think that if I did, I would do a better job at it. As I said at the start, I am not a graphical designer, an artist, or know much about the stuff that I talked about for half an hour. So anything in this video is at best an educated guess based on some research, and at worst just an opinion from a guy. If anyone who watched has more experience than me in the things I talked about and want to share that, either to add to what I said or to correct me, I would be very happy to read that. So, well, I hope you're all safe out there and have a good evening, everyone.